This is actually another part of what your thesis is, isn't it? That when, if we just stick to this gluing things together, the four dimensions of civilization, and then they come apart with modernity. But if they come apart with modernity, then we reinvent things to glue them back. There's a lot more of that going in our own, even in the Western so-called disenchanted world, than we kind of acknowledge.
Absolutely. And actually, this really leads on to what I was going to be the next thing on my list, which is Bruno Latour, who is an anthropologist, but who has devoted a lot of his work to science and to laboratory science. And two of his books are, again, symptoms of what I'm talking about. One is a book on laboratory science, the pasteurization of France and other works, in which he basically upset hard scientists very much, because he went in and did an anthropological study of science laboratories, looked at the social relations and the construction of their findings and so on. And he found that, in fact, much of the science is actually art. It's persuasion, half-true arguments, social relationships. And so, although they thought they were doing sort of foolproof scientific laboratory science, they were actually not much more scientific than a poet or a painter or any writer. I mean, this is implicit in Heisenberg and quantum theory anyway, but he made it into a sociological treatise, which showed that the distinction, that the one category which seems in the end, according to Popper, to separate science from non-science, which is the method, which is the empirical method of testing things through scientific experiments, even that, when he looked at it, is highly subjective and not as rigorous as scientists often would like to.
No, it's really interesting now, because philosophy of science, I've interviewed quite a few philosophers of science, and they say the same. They say basically we've no idea what we've given up on trying to make the distinction between science and non-science, that we don't know quite how we could formally define science so that it doesn't capture a whole load of other stuff. So people have moved on. I mean, there are exceptions, but I mean, yes, you're right. I mean, all those attempts in the 70s and 80s to try and pin it all down didn't really come to much.
No, and but more related to what you were talking about before is the other part of Latour's work in his famous book, which I've talked about before, We Have Never Been Modern. And what he meant by that is, it's another way of expressing what I'm talking about. He says that, and he's talking about France, basically, though he doesn't say that, but he's talking about Catholic continental civilizations more than the Anglosphere. What he's saying is that our self-image of ourselves as modern is a delusion, because we haven't actually. What we've done is, in our attempt to separate things, we've just made new kinds of what he calls hybrids, which is mergers, something like Mary Douglas's purity and danger idea, that on the borders there are things which are mixed together and don't fit into one category or another. Those are dangerous things, and you can never get rid of them, because as soon as you set up one categorical scheme, it pushes other things into other anomalous and hybrid positions. Now, his contention in We Have Never Been Modern is that we are as filled with these kind of hybrid demons as any other civilization. It's just that we can't see them because we've recategorized everything. So at first I used to joke about him and say, well, of course, he's never been modern because he's French. I'm modern, but I now see that he's sort of right, that it may be more extreme there, but we do the same. We categorize and we separate, but there are always these things which escape, and reform as blurred entities in our world. But the important thing to realize is that the concept that we are modern and they are not modern is very strong in the West, and it's something I'll come back to because it's one of the hidden injuries. Our conceit, our self-belief that we have the answer, we are modern, they are savage, and in the old days they were primitives and savages and backward and pre-rational thought and all that stuff. That Western conceit based on a high estimation of science and our technological superiority is a delusion. And it's a very dangerous one because it means it condemns all those who don't think like us to being somehow inferior. And we have to go out and push them into being like us. So this self-delusion of modernity is, as you say, a very important feature